Hi, everyone. Welcome back to CHRTC 309. This is Sociology of Youth and Religion. Geez, I almost forgot what class I was teaching. All right, so in the next couple of lectures here on this next kind of section, we're going to talk about Gen Z. So Gen Z is the generation that's currently kind of in adolescence and moving through emerging adulthood. The youngest of them is going to be about 10 years old, with the oldest of them being about 26. So, right in our kind of age range and subject to a lot of influences. Um, Jean Twenge calls them iGen, and we'll talk about Jean Twenge in a sec. She calls them iGen specifically because of the technologies that they live with every day. Those internet technologies that have been ubiquitous since they were born, essentially. Um, and yeah, so basically, we're going to be talking about this group of people born roughly 1995 till about 2012. And we'll see, where they are kind of in their lives and in their religious lives. What does this generation kind of look like?
All right, so I think probably the top scholar of this generation, not that she's part of this generation, she's actually a Gen Xer, but the one who said, I think, the most interesting stuff about this generation is Jean Twenge, professor of psychology at San Diego State University, hugely influential right now, a whole bunch of kind of interesting books. The one that we're most concerned with here is her book iGen, which is specifically about Gen Z. But she had another one out just recently called Generations, which I'm still working my way through. It's a pretty chunky book, but looks at kind of different generational cohorts. And she's also written on Gen X, her generation, the millennials, and of course, I just talked about Gen Z. Her big kind of shtick is a couple of things. She looks at differences between generations, which, in the book Generation, she outlines as being principally driven by technology. And specifically, though, and especially with the millennials in Generation Me and in iGen, and then on with Generations as well. And she's now working with Jonathan Haidt, talking about this some more on long-term declines in happiness amongst youth, and that's been her big thing for probably the last, you know, 6 years that she's been talking about this. Okay, so most people call the generation after millennials Gen Z. Jean Twenge calls them iGen, although I think she's now kind of given up on the term. I think she was kind of trying to popularize it, but it didn't really catch on. Now, she doesn't think Gen Z is going to stick either, that eventually this generation is going to come to be called something else, because Gen Z is a little bit derivative from Gen X. Um, and I mean, I think that's entirely possible. Like, for a long time, millennials were being referred to as Generation Y, and eventually that got dropped in favor of millennial. And these things are quite organic. But I think the thing that Twenge thinks is really unique and different and kind of stands out about Gen Z is its kind of relationship with the internet, right? And so she takes the I in iGen from this naming convention that Apple had for their products, right? Where it started with the iMac back in the late 1990s. And then it was the iPod and the iPhone, where the I stood for internet, right? That these things were inherently meant to be connected to the internet. Um, and yeah, so she says that iGen themselves are kind of like an internet generation. And I mean, this makes sense, right? The World Wide Web, the internet, as we think of it, as accessed through browsers principally, um, really is a thing that appears commercially in 1995. Um, Prior to that, right, there had been like online systems and the internet had a sort of form prior to its wide sort of adoption, but it really does become a huge thing in 1995. And I mean, I'm old enough, sadly, to remember this kind of moment, right? Coming from a fairly well-off middle-class family, 1996, we got this thing called the internet, right? And we were suddenly able to access information in a totally different way. And I spent a ton of my time on the internet, but I remember the world before the internet, right? I was born in the 1980s, and I remember a world where the internet wasn't a thing. For iGen or Gen Z, this is not really going to be the case, right? Even those who maybe didn't have access to the internet at home, right, for whom the internet was a thing that they had at school, or maybe they went to the public library to get access to it, the internet still existed, right? It was still something that was around when they were young and when they were growing up. And so the kind of ubiquity of the internet, that it was sort of everywhere, right? That it was at home, that it was at the library, that it was at school, and eventually, post 2007, that it was in your pocket. This is the kind of defining feature of Gen Z. They don't remember, in most cases, a world where that was not the case. So, yeah, the ubiquity of the internet, defining feature of this generation. Okay, so this really changes, right? Like the internet was a thing, a major thing, and but it was tethered to computers, which were mostly kind of tethered to the wall. Even in the early 2000s, laptops were available. They were super expensive and they were heavy as a brick or a sack of bricks, really. The battery life on them was utterly, unbelievably terrible. And so they weren't as much a thing as they became. The internet wasn't as much of a thing as it became later on, where it became something that you could have all around you. And this really changes in 2007, right, with the introduction of the iPhone. Now, the iPhone isn't the first smartphone by any stretch of the imagination. Going back into the beginning of the 2000s, even the late 1990s, there had been these things called smartphones, or personal assistants, Palm Pilots, and the like, that were basically, sort of internet connected devices. Now, mostly they were bulky, kind of unwieldy, and mostly reserved for businessmen, right? It was mostly people who were in industry that had these types of devices. Probably the iconic one would be the BlackBerry, right? These things that had these kind of square screens and these great big physical keyboards that people typed on. Now, and I mean, they were really expensive. Data services were incredibly expensive, and companies were rolling it out kind of slowly. And yeah, it was for like the CEO of a company, right, who needed internet on the go and especially email on the go, but not for your kind of average Joe. And this really changes with the introduction of the iPhone in 2007, right? Steve Jobs walks onto the stage at Apple World and does the whole presentation. Oh, here's a new Mac. It's a 14% faster than last year's Mac. And then the presentation is about to end, and he's like, "Hey, we got one last thing, and it's the iPhone." And basically, the iPhone brings the smartphone and internet in your pocket to the masses, right? It's targeted at consumers rather than business people. Now, business people will eventually adopt it in great numbers too, because it's like, being Apple, it's the cool device that everybody wants. But initially, right, the biggest thing is that it brings kind of smartphone to the masses, and obviously, the touch screen display with the touch keyboard and all that stuff. Um, it's a big deal. It's actually a really big deal. Um, it's also principally targeted not at communication, really. It's targeted at consumption. And very quickly, it sort of merges with social media. Well, the first iPhone doesn't have a camera, I don't believe. By the time you get to the iPhone 3GS, it has a camera, so suddenly not a very good one. So the third iPhone, there was the iPhone 3G, and the iPhone 3GS. That third iPhone, I think has a camera. By the iPhone 4, you get the selfie camera. with all of its attendant problems. That was the first one I had, was an iPhone 4. Actually, the last iPhone I had too, because since then I've been off the Apple train, which is not important. But there will be a test question about it. No, I'm kidding. Um, but yeah, um, but yeah, I mean, really, blended with social media. Facebook was one of the companies that very quickly got apps onto the iPhone as soon as Apple opened up an app store, and kind of allowed other software to be installed on the iPhone. Facebook got on there very, very quickly and became a way of people sharing what they were doing right in this moment. And then, of course, you got all the other platforms kind of coming out, Twitter, and then Instagram, Snapchat, and on and on and on and on and on. It'll never end. Um, Now, I mean, it took a little while for adoption to pick up, right? The first few years were a little slow. The devices themselves were tremendously expensive, and it wasn't until Apple brought the prices down a little bit or came up with financing plans through phone carriers that people could actually afford to buy them. But by 2012, about half of Americans owned a smartphone, and about 75% of teenagers and about 94% of emerging adults had a smartphone. So, in a 5-year period, which is for technological adoption, is actually incredibly fast. 94% of people owning a phone, is really quick. Computers took much longer to gain general adoption, right? The PCs or home computers, probably took from their introduction in the 70s till 75% of American teenagers own them, or even half of American households, probably took a decade and a half. Um, Smartphones really were a kind of revolution, and they've revolutionized especially the lives of young people and twangy things, Gen Z in particular, because they don't remember a world without it. It is sort of their everything. I mean, there's good and bad things about it, right? And we'll talk about some of the things that are maybe not as good. But some great things about the smartphone coming to the world is Gen Z is probably the first generation for whom what's called the digital divide has basically been eliminated, at least in the U.S. and the developed world, right? Yeah, by 2010, as the internet was still um, a kind of luxury product in some ways, right? Especially high-speed internet. There was a pretty strong, in the 2010s, divide between lower SES and higher SES households in terms of who had the internet and how much time people spent online, with people with a higher SES spending much more time online. Now that divide today is virtually gone, right? Smartphones have democratized internet access to a great extent, right? Bringing it basically to pretty much everybody. Um, I mean, there's still a divide in terms of, I would say, the quality of devices that people have. Obviously, the poorer you are, the less likely you are to have a very high quality, very fast, or very new device. And technology and access to personal computers is very different. And home internet, in terms of broadband, home internet remains somewhat divided, but people at least have, some kind of access to the internet through their phones. Okay, and what Twangy says about, what she calls iGen, and what we'll call Gen Z, or I really favor Zoomer as my favorite kind of term for this generation. I'm going to do everything I can, which is next to nothing, to get that one to catch on. But for what Twangy says is iGen, basically, in terms of their kind of attitude towards the world, is a culmination of a steady move that started with the baby boomers towards greater and greater individualism, right? Where each generation following the boomers became more and more individualistic. Now, she thinks this is principally driven by technology. That said, there's some potential downfalls here with Gen Z. One of the things that she says is they're obsessed with safety, right? That this is a generation that, in both kind of their physical, their mental, I would venture to say their emotional kind of states, is incredibly kind of worried about how safe they are. Um, I guess you see this sometimes in kind of reflections, or not reflections, rather like interactions that say student groups have when a controversial speaker comes to campus, right? Certain groups, say LGBTQ groups or some other group that, let's say maybe the speaker might offend by whatever position they have, will often express concerns about feeling unsafe because this person is, um, expressing views that they don't like, or make them feel less than as an individual, right? And without commenting on that particular kind of grievance, it is a sort of obsession with safety, right? It's like I have to feel safe all the time. They also want to be physically safe, right? And Twenge will suggest that iGen, not only are they obsessed with psychological safety and feeling like no bad ideas are going to come my way that might upset me, they're also obsessed with their physical safety, right? So they really want to know they're safe. They're less interested in fast cars and freedom, as the country songs go, and more obsessed with, how many stars are there in the IIHS safety rating on that Toyota Corolla. So, I mean, she kind of calls them the Toyota Corolla generation. Why? Because what they want is a safe, reliable car when they get a car at all. And in other ways, right? They're obsessed with their safety, just worried about remaining safe. They're fearful about their economic future. And I mean, this, I think, is principally related to the fact that the world that they came into was one that had been sort of troubled by a number of economic shocks, particularly the very serious economic shock that millennials faced in 2008, 2009 with what sometimes referred to as the Great Recession, right? But a big economic dislocation that happened at the end of the George W. Bush presidency and the beginning of the first term of the Barack Obama presidency, where the stock market crashed, mortgages were falling apart in the U.S., right, because of these derivatives and mortgage-backed securities that had been sold, and a lot of millennials lost their jobs, right, or failed to launch, right? They had a tough time getting into the job market, principally because there were just no jobs. The Canada, the U.S., and Europe, and pretty much everybody entered a prolonged period of recession, driven by a financial crisis. So, they watched the millennials and they saw the millennials, struggle, and the stories that kind of came from the millennials was, wow, it's hard to get going in the world. So they're worried about their economic future. I guess, in the sense of like even safety, Gen Z is probably the most worried about things like climate change as well. They're very worried that the world will not be a safe place for them or their children if they choose to have any, which many of them are suggesting at least that they will not. So Gen Z is also a generation that, at least in the way it articulates things, and certainly my interaction with Gen Z students suggests this, right? They have no patience for inequality. Whatever inequality is based on, right, whether it's gender, race, sexual orientation, or whatever, Gen Z really is not terribly interested. Um, Especially, I think, about sexual orientation. This one, seems to resonate really strongly with Gen Z, sexual orientation. And now I guess, I think it wasn't as big in the kind of public mind when Twenge wrote iGen in 2017, but definitely since then has sort of exploded on the scene. Is gender identity, right? So you get the SOGI or SOGI. Any inequality or discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity is something that Gen Z has no patience for in ways very different, I think, from past generations. Race also very important to them, and obviously we've seen that, with the reaction, especially by young people, to things like the death of George Floyd and such, right? Was a powerful moment. Um, and gender, obviously, gender-based discrimination, particularly, here we're talking, male, female, principally, um, discrimination against women. They're not a generation that is terribly interested in this, and finds it quite off-putting. Okay, they're also growing up in a lot of ways slower than previous generations on all sorts of markers. All the things that kind of were markers of entry into late adolescence and emerging adulthood are things that increasingly, it seems, iGen or Gen Z is doing a lot later. So they get their driver's licenses and first jobs later than Gen X or millennials, right? Driver's licenses especially, and this used to be like a marker of freedom, for a marker of freedom for Gen X and for millennials was, you turned 16 and you went down and you did your driver's test and you got your driver's license so that you could drive yourself, and suddenly it opened up a whole world of freedom for you. And getting jobs, right? Having your own kind of income was also something that was very important. And these are both things that Gen Z is doing considerably later than millennials or Gen X did. In terms of romance, they're less likely to date. Teens are much less likely to date than previous generations. Having a now teenage daughter, she's 13, almost 14. I feel no sadness about this at all. They have sex later and less frequently than past generations, right? So 15% fewer 12th graders had sex in 2015 than in 1991, and almost 50% fewer 9th graders had sex than in 1991. So, I mean, again, I think, especially with the 9th graders, no one should feel sad about this number in the slightest. Maybe, that's me being the parent of an almost 9th grader. But yeah, I mean, fewer of them are having sex, right? And they spend more time with their parents, right? They spend more time at home. They're more comfortable with their parents taking them shopping, driving them around, right? They're less apparently wanting to be independent from their parents. Okay, so, like I said, iGen's really physically safe. They smoke less, right? I mean, though, like when we add in vaping, rates have been going up, and it's about 1 in 5, about 20%, who are using some kind of nicotine product, whether it's cigarettes or vaping, more vaping than anything. But they do less drugs, right? We've seen drug use rates dropping pretty steadily. With Gen Z, they drink less and they drink later in life, right? So they're less prone to drinking alcohol. They're less likely to drive hazardously, less likely to get into a car driven by someone intoxicated. They're less likely to get murdered, be in a fight. Parents know where they are 75% of the time, and with whom 65% of the time. A lot of this has to do with the fact that they're on devices all the time, right? They actually don't leave home as much in general. They are simply on devices at home. Like, I think I may have said it before. It's not so much Netflix and chill. It's just Netflix, right? They just watch Netflix. And if you're just watching Netflix or whatever, Disney Plus, who gives it, what you're watching, you can't get murdered because you're at your house. I mean, you can, but the odds are far less likely than if you're at the bar, right? Or out at a bush party with your friends or something like that. Their parents know where they are 75% of the time, and with whom 65% of the time. That's a lot. I would venture that as monitoring technology has gotten better, this has actually probably gone up, right? There's far more parental control apps. in parental monitoring apps in 2023 than there were in 2017. And there's going to continue to be more and more of them over time. So, they're given less independence too, right? Even as young kids, things that would have been common a couple generations ago, for Gen Xers or millennials, right? Walking home from school, staying home until your parents get home, maybe for an hour or two, have become considerably less common. We've seen the rise of, out of school care and after school programs to take care of young people, which used to be kind of the rarity. Because, either one of two things was true. Either one parent, typically mom, was home, or they were latchkey kids. They were allowed to be home alone. Now, one of the things that Twenge says too is that Gen Z is, as a result, on the edge of a deep mental health crisis. Okay, so just a few numbers here, and most of this, if you've taken sociology of youth with me, I present all these numbers in sociology of youth. If you haven't and you're interested, I really deep dive and spend a couple of hours of the course just diving into some of the numbers on Gen Z and their mental health crisis. And I'm adding new statistics all the time. These are just statistics that are really, really recent. This from the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Study, looking at numbers from 2011 to 2021. So the CDC obviously is the Center for Disease Control in the U.S. And we see, a pretty substantial rise, in this 10-year period between 2011 and 2021 in experiencing persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, right? This would be a 14% increase kind of overall. They weren't, tracking, asking people if they were experiencing poor mental health until the 2021 study, but at that point, 29%, so almost 30% said they were. Seriously consider attempting suicide. Not huge kind of change here. A 6% increase, but we see the trend line, right, increasing every year, essentially from except for 2017 where it went down a little bit, from 2011 to 2021. Making a suicide plan up 5%, and again, kind of increasing pretty steadily. Attempted suicide, pretty, not a big increase, but coming up at 10%, so trend going in the wrong way. And we're injured in a suicide attempt that had to be treated by a doctor or nurse is even. The trend hasn't gone up or down. So troubling numbers there. Okay, so here, percentage of males and females who reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, right? And so the CDC, again, the same body of data, the Youth Risk Behavior Study, which is this longitudinal cross-sectional kind of study. You had females on the blue line and males the brown line. And, what we see, essentially is, a good steady increase for females, right? In terms of feeling, persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, 21%, which is huge. That's a huge increase, right? That's really, really, really troubling. So much more for females than males, but males were not, excluded either. An 8% rise for males of feelings of, persistent sadness or hopelessness. So this is, I think, concerning. And this is the crisis that Twenge's speaking about, right? Okay, one more here, right? Percentage of females and males who seriously consider attempting suicide. And again, the trend lines, increasing. 11% for females, only 1% for males, so it's still going in the wrong direction, but not a huge increase for males. But the big increase, and again, females have always been a little bit less likely to consider this, but it's risen, this huge percent. It's gone up a huge percent, and we've now seen, females thinking about it and in far greater percentages than we ever have, right? This is rising much quicker than we've ever seen. All right, so U.S. teens with U.S. teens with major depressive symptoms. This from a different study, the National Study of I don't remember what DUH stands for actually, but NSDUH data graphed by Twenge Cooper or Twenge et al. And you see, okay, so what you basically see is things were kind of flat before 2012, right before the iPhone, or before the year where half of teenagers own the iPhone, and then it shoots up for girls, and it shoots up a little slower for boys. Now, this said, like these numbers, so this says, there's been a 145% increase since 2010 in girls with major depression. That number looks huge, right? But it still accounts for, excuse me, about 30%, right? Which is bad. 30% of girls of U.S. teens girls have major depression. This is not a good thing. And for boys, it's lower, right? Just above, we're probably talking about 12%, above 10%. Starting from lower points, right? Probably about 14% in girls, now up to almost 30, 15% rise. And starting at 5% to about 11% for boys. So, a 6% rise. Still, especially for boys, a small percentage, but increasing in very worrisome ways. And this is why Twenge thinks they are on the brink of a major mental health crisis. Okay, one of the what Twenge thinks is driving this, and what she thinks the cause for concern is essentially the fact that iGen teenagers are spending more time on devices and less time with each other, right? So they're physically safer. Why? Well, because they're at home most of the time, but they're spending less time volunteering, working, doing homework, in sports, or attending religious services. They have more leisure time than millennials did at the same time in their lives, about an hour and a half more of time that's unstructured where they're not doing anything because they're doing fewer things than previous generations. What do they do with that time? Well, most of them spend it on their smartphones, right? They spend it on social media, on TikTok, and on other, things that aren't in-person interaction. And yeah, I mean, from 2012 on, we've seen skyrocketing rates of depression. All right, just to illustrate this, and just so you can kind of see what it looks like, right? This is a chart. American Time Use Study. So another study. Basically, and if you look at it, right, what you'll see is that in 2003, 15 to 24, spent over 2 hours with friends per day, right? So it was like 160 minutes, right? That's like 2 hours and 40 minutes with friends. It's not quite 160, but it's close. And this kind of declined, it popped back up. And then, starting around 2012, it just keeps on going down. And obviously takes a really hard drop from about 2018 forward. Obviously we have COVID in here, which doesn't help. This block here is maybe a little bit of COVID. But even if you just take 2018 as your kind of last point, you've already lost, almost an hour, probably about an hour of time spent per day with friends. So they're spending a lot less time with people and a lot more time on, devices. And smartphones are so ubiquitous in their lives, right, that nearly all iGeners sleep with their phones at their bedside or under their pillow, right? It is their constant companion. The last thing they see before they go to sleep, the first thing they see in the morning. iGen high schoolers, spend, what is it, about 6 hours and 25 minutes a day, or 6.25 hours a day, rather. So 6.25 hours a day on devices, right? And it's, texting is the biggest one. On the internet, which we can say is probably mostly things like videos and TikToks and social networking. And this data will have gotten more granular since then. Gaming for about an hour and a half, half hour of video chat. And then, add an hour and a half of watching TV, which they do well on their smartphones. And you've got a good chunk of the day kind of consumed, 7.75 hours consumed with devices of some kind. Okay, and it's pretty ubiquitous, right? 87% of 12th grade girls use social media every day. 75, so 3/4 of 12th grade boys. Race and class don't seem to play any difference, right? Whether you're rich, poor, white, black, Hispanic, no real difference in terms of who is on social media. And only 2% of 12th grade girls never use the technology. Now, I think I'm fond of saying about the statistic that if you have something that 98% of people do, you have one of the most ubiquitous phenomenons ever in human history. It rivals, other human phenomena like eating and sleeping in terms of how ubiquitous it actually is for 98% of the population to do something. It's astounding, right? It's social behaviors almost never travel this way, right? Like you might have, and I mean, media behaviors are probably almost unique in this, in terms of like, you know, 98% use the technology sometimes. I can't think of anything else that would have approached that kind of ubiquity. That wasn't forced, right? Like reading, but yeah, you had to read for school, right? So this is how pervasive these technologies are and how deeply they've affected this generation, I think should be obvious. Okay, this is probably my favorite quote out of the book iGen. People party because they're bored. They want something to do. Now we have Netflix. You can watch series nonstop, right? So people don't need to go out with each other anymore, and they don't. So as we saw, teens are spending less time with friends than ever before. So this little chart, right? Percentage of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders who get together with friends every day or nearly every day has dropped right off. It used to be better than half, right, of 12th graders, and well better than half for 10th and 8th graders as well. And it's dropped down, below a third for pretty much all of these populations. And that's, the last data that's here is 2014. I have no idea what this data looks like beyond that, but I suspect it's not good. And I guess, time spent with friends has declined a lot, so we can sort of guess. Teens are spending less time, the Gen Z teens are spending less time together than ever before. College-aged Gen Zers are spending about an hour less, and that again was as of 2015, with friends than millennials did, replaced all by some form of screen time. Okay, and this seems to matter. Why? Because people who spend more time online seem to be more unhappy, right? There's a stronger correlative relationship between online activity and, risk factors of being unhappy. And the more time you spend doing kind of embodied or in person or real world tangible things, whether it's interacting with physical things like a book or homework, or print media, right, or in-person social interaction, or religious service attendance, or sports and exercise, you have a negative correlation with chance of being unhappy. So over half of those who spend 10 hours a week online said they were unhappy, and almost half of those who said they spend 6 hours a week online. So being online, not necessarily good for you, but it's where Gen Z is. All right, and the last slide, in this section, basically, if we look at, people, what is their kind of mental health looking like? And again, I've shown you some more recent stats just a second, but as of 2015, where were they? People who felt left out of things or felt a lot of times felt lonely, those things had jumped pretty strongly from, about 2011, 2012, where more people were reporting those feelings, and those who said they were satisfied with their lives. And this is both of these are according to Monitoring the Future, which is a really interesting study of young people. The question, feeling left out, feeling lonely, that question started in 1991. And so we have a relatively short kind of data span for it, but it's been being asked by Monitoring the Future since 1991. And 12th graders who are satisfied with their lives as a whole and with themselves, this question has been asked since 1976, so a very long timeline for us. And we've seen, it was improving, right? It was getting better, getting better, getting better, getting better. for a long time. It had been kind of been climbing, and it takes a sharp drop with the advent of the smartphone. So we can kind of say pretty good chance that smartphones are not great for Gen Z's mental health, and the numbers reflect that. So, all right, that is it for talking about who iGen is and what they're looking at. Big, deep mental health crisis a brewing for Gen Z, sadly.